We'll go ahead and get started. So, thank you all for joining us. My name is Mimi Earnest-Stanley. I'm a physical therapist and athletic trainer. I'm the chair of the Adaptive Sports Special Interest Group in the American Academy of Sports PT. I'm also an assistant professor at the University of Cincinnati in the physical therapy and athletic training programs. I own my own small private practice where I work with people who have chronic disabilities and adaptive athletes. And then I'm also involved in our local adaptive sports community through some nonprofits. Um, Prior to the beginning of this year, I worked with USA Wheelchair Rugby, but then I taking some time off to focus on my family. So I'm excited to co-lead today's journal club with Maddie, and Maddie will introduce herself and kick us off.
Hi everyone, I'm Maddie Felchlin. I am a third-year student at the University of Cincinnati. Mimi is one of my professors at Cincinnati. I am currently on rotation right now, and I will be graduating in December. So sorry if you hear my dog in the background. So today we're going to be talking about, Mimi, you can go to the next slide. We'll be talking about this article called The Effectiveness of Tailored Injury and Illness Prevention and Management to Reduce the Prevalence and Severity of Health Problems in Adaptive Sports, which was published in May 2025. We chose this article mainly because it was a recent article that was published, and we haven't really talked about prevention in adaptive sports in a while. It's also talking about a type of technology that's not commonly used. So, these are the three main learning objectives that we'll be discussing today. The first learning objective will be able to identify key components of the TIPUS intervention, which we'll talk about, and discuss how personalized approaches based on athlete impairments, sports demands, and health status can be adapted to their own clinical settings. For the second objective, we will gain insight into common health challenges in adaptive sports and learn how regular monitoring and early individualized interventions can reduce the impact of these issues over time. And then finally, for the third intervention, we'll be able to outline a basic framework for implementing routine check-ins and feedback systems with their athletes to support ongoing injury and illness prevention, drawing from the TIPUS model. So to set the stage for this study, we're going to look at a broader context of illness and injury prevention for adaptive sports. So in the Netherlands, where this study was conducted, the primary sports season occurs in the summer. Among Dutch athletes with physical disabilities, about 1/3 experience an illness or injury during the season. That rate is nearly 3 times higher than what we see in non-disabled athletes, which can highlight a significant disparity in health outcomes. These injuries and illnesses don't just affect the athletic performance, they can also impact activities of daily living, and then they can also have a broader consequence for independence and quality of life. Well, there's been a recent increase in epidemiological research focused on adaptive sports. There's still a major gap when it comes to prevention strategies tailored to this population. So this study specifically aims to address that gap by testing a personalized automated intervention system designed to reduce injury, illness, and the burden of athletes with physical impairments. So now that we've seen the high injury and illness rates in adaptive sports, we're going to look at why this particular intervention was developed. Health monitoring is a promising approach because it has a low threshold and a low cost. It doesn't require in-person visits or expensive equipment, and it can be implemented into larger groups, even remotely, which is ideal for athletes training in different environments. There's also precedent for this kind of approach. A 2018 study by Hasenpel has colleagues showed that automated personalized preventative advice based on the health monitoring reduced injuries by 12% in the able-bodied trail runners. So that study helped establish the potential of digital scalable interventions in sports injury prevention. So building on that concept, the researchers developed the TIPUS system, which stands for Tailored Injury Prevention in Adaptive Sports. It's designed specifically for athletes with physical impairments, with taking into account their unique needs and sport specific tasks. So, this study essentially tests whether a similar automated approach can be effective in a more complex and diverse population. So we're going to walk through the PICO framework, which used in this study evaluates this intervention in adaptive sports. So the population for this study included 107 adult athletes with physical impairments who participated in adaptive sports at least once a week. Importantly, athletes with only visual, hearing, or intellectual impairments were excluded so they could focus primarily on those physical limitations. The impairments presented were very diverse, so it included spinal cord related injuries, nerve deficiencies, neuromuscular disorders, brain disorders, and then also impaired passive range of motion. This intervention was an automated online tool that provided a personalized prevention and management advice to the athletes. The advice was based on three key factors, which was the athlete's weekly reported outcome or health problems, their specific type of physical impairment, and then the sport that they participated in. For the control group, they just continued on with their usual sports participation without receiving any of the tailored feedback or intervention. This allowed the researchers to isolate the effect of the TIPA system. For the outcomes, the primary outcome was the prevention of injuries and illnesses over a 40-week sports season. And then the secondary outcomes included the incident rates, severity scores, time lost due to health problems, and the overall burden of injuries and illnesses. So this PICO structure just sets the foundation for understanding for how the study was designed. So this slide just outlines the core purpose and objectives of the study. The overarching purpose was to assess whether the TIPA system could effectively reduce both the prevalence and severity of the sports-related health problems in athletes with physical impairments. This is important because these athletes face a higher risk of injury and illness, and current prevention strategies are very limited. So like I said before, the primary objective was just to determine whether the intervention was more effective than no intervention at all in reducing the prevalence of illness and injuries. To measure this, the researchers used a questionnaire called the Oslo Sports Trauma Research Center questionnaire, which was specifically adapted for athletes with physical impairments. And this tool allowed them to have consistent weekly tracking of those health problems. The secondary objectives focused specifically on the severity, so looking at how the intervention impacted the intensity and consequences of the illness and injuries. This included several matrix, like I mentioned before, the weekly questionnaire adherence, severity scores, incident rates, and the days lost due to health problems and the overall burden. So together, these outcomes provide a comprehensive picture about how often athletes were affected and how seriously they were affected. These objectives set the stage for evaluating whether a tailored automated intervention like TIPA's can make a meaningful difference in the adaptive sports health management.
Awesome. Thanks, Maddie. So a little bit more about the study design. So this was a non-blinded randomized controlled trial, and I'll explain kind of how that worked in a second. But it spanned the one sports season, like Maddie said, the summer season, and it lasted for 40 weeks. They began recruiting in December of 2021, and then the last group of participants in the study finished up in March of 2022. So we know it was a group of Dutch athletes with only physical impairments who were over the age of 18. So Maddie gave us that list of sort of the following, the categories of athletes, those impairments that they had, and told us a little bit about the exclusion criteria. So what happened for randomization is that once a participant consented, they had sort of this layered randomization process. So first, it looked on physical impairment based on those groups above, like Maddie said, and then it divided those 5 impairments into whether they participated in a seated sport or a standing sport. And that kind of gave us the 10 different randomization options. And after they signed up, the sort of lead of the study, the primary or the lead author, then went in and was unblinded and then put the athletes in the group, whether they were in the intervention group or in the control group. I'm going to switch my screen share really quick and see if I can just pull up the article to go through the flow of the study design too, so you can kind of see how it worked out. Give me 1 second. Share. Okay. There we go. All right, so I think that's pulled up for you now. But you can see once they sign the informed consent based on their disability, and then what group, if they participated in a sitting or a standing sport, they were either put in the intervention group, which ended up having 60 athletes in it, or the control group, which had 47 athletes in it. And then, as Maddie said, each week the athletes filled out a questionnaire. And as they filled out the questionnaire, after the baseline questionnaire weekly, those in the intervention group would receive some type of like tailored feedback that was created by a group of medical professionals based on whether, the type of, if they reported having an injury or an illness or nothing at all. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. I have a little diagram to show you. But overall, there were 12 people who dropped out, 6 in each group. We'll talk a little bit more about the characteristics of the participants in the study when we get to the results. Go back. Okay, so a little bit more about the intervention group. So after they were put into the intervention group, they would fill out that weekly survey, and then they would talk about if they had any health complaints or if they had an injury or an illness. And based on the severity, if it was something minor or more severe, if it was minor, it would give them some like management options to prevent their injury or illness from getting worse. If this sort of automated program determined that it was something more severe, it would tell them to seek medical attention, and it would give them some information on where they could find it near them. An example of what this kind of looked like was provided in the study, and I thought this was helpful. So weekly, if they said they had no reported health concern, then they would just kind of get some general but yet tailored to based on their sport and their physical disability information on a health or an injury and illness prevention strategy. So this example here talks about material and equipment, saying, when you get new equipment, make sure you get it fitted by someone and looked at by someone with experience. You can do it once a year or more often to help prevent, maybe some friction injuries or overuse injuries based on malfitting equipment. If they reported something like a minor muscle concern, they'd get some information on, overload and overtraining, and some ideas on how they could help prevent their current issue from getting worse. And then if they reported something like a major blister problem or a major wound, then it would direct them to seek some medical attention, something local, if they have medical staff, and options like that. So the statistical analysis that was used, so for that primary aim of figuring out the prevalence and comparing that between groups, they calculated the weekly prevalence. So they took the total number of weekly reported health problems and divided that by the total number of responses to the questionnaire that week. And then they calculated an average weekly prevalence over the entirety of the study, so for 40 weeks. And in both of those analyses for the primary aim, recurrent and subsequent injuries and illnesses were included. For the secondary aim, so that's just giving us some more the information related to days and time lost. They took the incidence of injuries per 1,000 exposure hours using a 95% confidence interval. Then they had an average weekly severity and used again a 95% confidence interval from the severity scores, which could range from 0 to 100 based on the athlete's perception for both injury and illness. Then they divided a total cumulative severity score for each reported health problem. Again, that our health problems in this are going to be injury or illness um, by the number of weeks that the problem was reported. Then they had that placed into two severity categories, so non-substantial and something substantial. And that was based on the responses to two of the questions in the OSTRC on whether they responded selected option 1 or 2 or option 3, 4, and 5, which would make it more substantial. And then they calculated time lost as the median number of days lost from a sport with the corresponding quartiles, and the injury and illness burden was reported as the number of days lost per 1,000 exposure hours within the corresponding 95% confidence interval. And there's more statistical analysis. So the authors also looked to explore the relationship between the intervention control groups and the prevalence and severity of injury. So they used what's called a multinomial logistical mixed methods model, or sorry, mixed model. And using that, they look at the intention to treat. So that accounts for both categorical outcome variables to make sure that results aren't dependent on repeated observations. So think like long-term injuries that keep lasting. And then for the first model of that, the intervention group was added as a predictor. For the second model that they ran of the MLMM, they adjusted for potential co-founders, confounders, which are different things that could affect the outcomes based on the baseline of the groups, like differences between the groups. And then they ran treatment times time on both of those models to investigate the influence of time on the affected intervention. Then they looked at some regression coefficients, and again, they used a p-value of less than 0.05 to consider something statistically significant. The authors also wanted to look at the intervention control group, injury and illness rates against time lost. So they used a standard approach for cost-effective analysis. And to do this, they account for there being a non-normal distribution of the results. So that means in most athletes or in some athletes, there may not be a lot, there may be 0 injuries, but in a small group of athletes, that group of athletes might have had multiple injuries. So they use this non-parametric bootstrapping method with that, which just would replicate the data set for these potential different outcomes, and then calculated 95% confidence intervals around the differences when looking at time lost to injury and illness rates. We have some graphs that'll help some of that make a little bit more sense. Before we get to that, though, I know it's a little hard to read on the screen, but this was available in the article too. So this is table 2. It looks at the results and the characteristics of the participants in the study. So there were 107 athletes total. Like I said, 12 total withdrew, or 6 from each group. When they came up with their sample size, their goal was 50. So they were near that, which was nice, even though it's still a relatively small sample size, considering the differences or the heterogeneity in adaptive athletes with all these different subgroups. But they had a pretty nice, I think, distribution of male versus female participants. The average age of the athletes was a little bit older than just what some of us might see clinically. So, 43 to 46 years with a standard deviation around 14 years. You can see some comparisons of the different physical impairment characteristics. So, looking at congenital versus acquired, if something was deemed musculoskeletal, if were in those different subgroups that Madi previously talked about. They also looked at whether or not someone was a daily wheelchair user or if they used different types of walking aids. They looked at if the athlete participated in one sport or more than one sport. Also got information on whether they were recreational athletes, which kind of looked like the majority of the athletes were recreational versus nationally competitive versus internationally competitive, which was the smallest group within each group. And then again, they looked at seated versus non-seated and whether or not the athlete participated in a team sport or an individual sport. And then they got sort of like a baseline average number of hours participated in, which was 4.16 hours compared to 4.02 hours difference between the control and the intervention group. As for the intervention effect, that's what we have going on in this table. Um, just to kind of orient you to the table a little bit, if you didn't have the opportunity to read the whole article. So again, all health problems are sort of our total numbers combined for injury and illness. For something as an injury, that was anything that was reported as like a soft tissue damage. And the researchers did go in and sort of look at the correctness of the participant responses and made sure they were correctly if they had identified if they were in the injury group or the illness group, just to make sure that data was correct. Overall, right, if we're looking at these different confidence intervals, there was no difference of prevalence and injury of health problems. So that's for total health problems between the intervention group and the control group. So that means, right, that intervention did not significantly reduce the prevalence of injury or illness when compared to control. So if you're thinking about the responses that the participants had, that's saying, they have their three option: no health related problem, injury, or illness. When that intervention group said no health related problem, and then they got sort of that tailored but still like a little bit generalized automated response for injury prevention strategies, that's what we're looking at here for this aim one of the study. There was also no significant difference between the intervention and control groups on incident and severity measures over time. What the study did find was that there was a significant group times time interaction effect. So for that, P was less than 0.001 with regards to the prevalence of injuries over time. So if you look at this chart here, what this is saying is that the increase of all injuries in the control group and the decline of the injuries in the intervention group over time. So looking at all injuries in the control group, right, that solid blue line, it kind of goes up a little bit, but if you in general look at the all injuries in the intervention group, it has a natural sort of decline over time. That's what they found, that it was significant. So showing a decrease in injury prevalence in the intervention group and an increase over time in the control group, even though the prevalence overall, there was no significant difference. The study also looked at rate versus severity. So when I was talking about the bootstrapping that they were doing, really this shows that the intervention group had an illness rate and a time loss rate compared with the rates of the control group. this I think is better explained when we compare time loss, right? Because typically if something is more severe, it may lead to an increase in time lost from injury. So in these panels in figure 6, the very center of both of these panels is the control group. And then what they did is they took all of those bootstrapping samples that they kind of filled in, and they plotted them. Um, and each dot represents one injury time loss pair. And the red kind of shows where that intervention group fell relative to the control group. So on panel A, right, if we look at where this red dot is for the intervention group, it's sort of in the panel or the section that says that they had a lower injury rate. However, they had a higher average time loss, right? So even though the control or the intervention group may have had lower injury rates, those injuries may have been more severe, and that may have led to a higher average time loss, which was the most sort of significant thing that they found. If we look over on panel B, that is showing that there may be a lower illness rate. So on the right in panel A, we're talking about injury. I'm sorry, that's the left. And we're talking about injury on the left in panel A and illness in panel B on the right. So for illness, so a non-musculoskeletal soft tissue injury, they had a lower illness rate in the intervention group, and a lower average time lost per illness compared to the control group. So just some discussions on the study. The accessibility of the tool, as Madi said in the introduction, was good, right? You don't have to be in person. You don't have to set up an appointment to give athletes access to this sort of reporting tool. However, there were some weaknesses and limitations, is that because of the tool was so minimalistic, right? When I picked this article, I was like, ooh, something tailored. But then sort of reading the response about how it was automated was interesting to me, because it does keep things pretty minimalistic. Again, with pretty much any study related to adaptive sports, we have a small sample size that can be really hard to analyze in the best way because of the heterogeneity of the population. So those 10 subgroups, right? This was really just an education only intervention, right? We didn't look at the effects of exercise or other types of interventions that we can do as physical therapists. There was an 85% spot response rate on average for the 40 weeks of that survey, which, if you ask me, I think that's pretty good. Um, but because it was only 85%, there was some missing data that I think that the authors tried to appropriately adjust for with their analysis. However, that might spew the descriptive statistics. Need to fix that slide. A little spelling error there. So in order to try to enhance the response rate, they did have 2 digital reminders. So the athletes would get an email on Monday saying, "Hey, fill out your survey," and then the system would give them their automated sort of response if they were in the intervention group, and then they would get 2 more reminders during the week. And if they still hadn't filled it out, they got a call. So calling is somewhat hands-on for a study like this. But we have to consider, as a potential limitation of the study, that an athlete might have just completed the survey, but not really taken into account the educational opportunity there to sort of implement, whatever type of feedback they were getting from the automated response system related to prevention or helping their injury. And then we'll talk a little bit about, like, what does the statistical significance have to do with this compared to actual clinical significance. So hopefully we'll get some more conversation going here as we get into more discussion. So we'll kind of open up the floor based on you guys who are here. If we want to maybe go around and share your experience in adaptive sports, any thoughts that you had on the article to get us kind of started. We'll do that. I won't call anyone out because I know I don't know, it's 8:30 for me and some people might just be kind of listening along, but did anybody have any additional thoughts? I'll kind of hold the floor open for about a minute before we get more into some of the particular objectives and questions that Maddie and I had.
Did you guys use anything in rugby, or does the Olympics, do they have any type of preventative training or implementation that they do currently? And maybe it's sport specific too.
Mhm. Yeah, so for they do get, I'll say I'll like answer this in two parts. So during the Olympic and Paralympic Games, there is a huge push for like data collection for like information on prevalence and in incidents and all of that. Like those studies usually come out a year and a half after each game. So I don't think we have them yet for they haven't been published, at least haven't been published for the entirety of the games yet from Paris, but they do have studies on that. So more of that was more of like a epi info versus actual prevention, but we don't do like as far as like when I was with wheelchair rugby, we didn't do any actual studies on anything, but we do have a strength and conditioning coordinator that we would work with. We had a nutritionist and like a mental health or sports psych professional who came in and worked really closely with the team to help make sure people were prepared in various ways for sport and competition. But no, we never did anything that was sort of automated like this, um, as far as like work that I've done with rugby or outside of rugby. Thanks for the question, Cody. Any other thoughts?
Can I ask a clarifying question on it? If you know, so with the automated responses, was it specific to their impairment? Like there were automated responses based on that, or was it just based on seated versus
Mm-hmm.
non-seated?
It was from reading the study, it was based on their physical impairment, as well as if they played a seated or standing sport. So that was good because that made it somewhat even more tailored, I think, as far as you can get with automated interventions. Good question. Okay. All right. Oh, go ahead.
This is more of just a comment. I wonder if having something automated would be helpful, because I know like in concussion rehab, especially people that are really wanting to get back to stuff, sometimes they try to find ways around the outcome measures and the testing. And I wonder if having an automated system where, or maybe it'd make it harder too, because people could figure out how to not accurately report their data to try to, I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that. I just, sometimes people try to blow through the test so that they don't have to go on restrictions and stuff.
Yeah, that's a good thought too. I think particularly with concussion, right? Because you usually would want like a return to play protocol guided by a professional. So I don't know. But they could benefit like the one thing, like we said, like a strength of this study was that it was pretty accessible. So like a more rural recreational athlete who was participating in the study and didn't have access to a medical provider could still get feedback from something like that on a concussion. But yeah, like you said, if people could definitely manipulate it if they wanted to, based on whatever, outcomes that they had. But I think this testing was kind of general, like surveillance, or sorry, the outcome measure they used was like a general surveillance outcome measure. And even though they gave the tailored advice, I am curious this would be a good one to like talk to the authors on and see and get a little bit more insight on what some of those like tailor responses looked like. Okay, so our first sort of discussion point, right? So hopefully from this, we can evaluate how tailored injury and illness prevention strategies can be integrated into clinical practice. I think it's hard, like it's hard to do that for most of us because not many of us work like strictly with adaptive athletes, and a lot of but how we can still use prevention strategies, I think. So I was curious what some of your guys' thoughts were like on the automation, and like Marin asked like the how it was actually like sort of tailored versus what this could look like with the growing use of artificial intelligence versus like having an actual provider go in and do one-on-one or like small group education session. Um, and then thinking to like this was a primary educational intervention, which can be good and can give autonomy to athletes, but also um, like what other interventions could be done as far as like exercise, manual therapies, other types of interventions and things like that. So has anybody done anything related to injury prevention in their work, either with adaptive sport or outside of adaptive sport? Or seen any, read any other articles related to it? I feel like there's one out there on um shoulder, like shoulder injury prevention in wheelchair athletes. And I can't remember, it's separate from like the classic, if anybody's a neurotherapist, like the classic stomps article. Cody, I'm looking at you. The classic stomps article for shoulder health for people with spinal cord injury. But I feel like this one came out of the University of Alabama, and it was still like pretty basic. I could be totally wrong about it. But I feel like I read one that was pretty basic, just like TheraBand exercises too, which is what essentially like stomps is, but I think it was a little bit more athletic performancy driven for this other study that I'm thinking of, that looks more exercise, which I feel personally, and I don't know, but I feel like if we had tailored exercise interventions, that could potentially at least help with some of the injury prevention versus, um, something that's maybe a little bit more educational, but then you have to look at, compliance and everything like that.
I think it'd be neat because almost to use it as like a triage type scenario, like depending on what you respond into the program is, all right, try this, or is further like assessment warranted, you should probably see your athletic trainer or go see a PT for rehab, depending on where people fall in that process. Because sometimes maybe they don't necessarily need to go straight to rehab. It's just a matter of calm down, tailor your training protocol, and then if pain continues to worsen, great, go get rehab. But from a preventative standpoint, I don't know. I've only ever used the stomps, and it's not my favorite thing in the world because it is really just a general blanket that the external rotator stretch, but half the time you don't need the mobility. Half the time, like it's very generalized, and I don't think it does much good. And I'm sorry for going on record for saying that, but for all of my people with spinal cord, it's not personalized enough to meet their needs, and the whole 3 sets of 10 or whatever their general prescription, I just don't. I think it's a good place to start, but it's not the end all be all. I'll leave it at that. Sorry.
No, you're good. Yeah. And I like that. Yeah, I'd be curious to see if they were to add in, when they looked at the severity of an injury, like whether it was something that was minimal or something that was substantial, like a secondary, like an ancillary study of, okay, now, we divided them into um, no sports related health problem. And then, okay, they have an injury. is it minimal or is it substantial? And now between those groups, people are going to go work like one-on-one with a healthcare provider. And like what that would do and to affect like time loss. Like I don't think it would necessarily affect prevalence, but see if there was an effect on time loss of, okay, we just gave them this automated tailored information versus we gave them this one-on-one, more tailored, personalized intervention, I guess. That's good thoughts. Okay, so I think learning objectives 2 and 3 kind of tie together. So this group that authored and ran this study, they actually sort of did more of like a registry that was an epidemiological, got some epi information on adaptive athletes in the Netherlands. The timeline for that, I have the article linked here. It's also referenced in the article that we chose. But it was September 2020 to June 2021, which is really interesting because it's got COVID in there. So if you think of the illnesses and how that affected, but for that study, there were 368 health problems reported by 95 athletes over, again, they looked at 40 weeks. There were 258 injuries compared to 110 illnesses. And then the average weekly prevalence for overall health problems, so combined, was 48%. For injuries, it was 36 or 34.6%, and then illnesses was 13.4%. Which, if you go, it's interesting because if you go and you look at the illness reports from Tokyo, I think, don't quote me on it, they were actually lower because everybody was masked and everybody was following this very strict protocol to help prevent the spread of potential illness. So that could be why the illness rate here is so low compared to the illness rates that we have in this study, which let me like, okay, I guess it's not that different. Maybe I was just getting excited. But just interesting things to think about. And then differences were found when they were considering the severity of injuries during this study. So the highest severity scores were found in athletes with limb deficiency when we're thinking about those different subgroups. And then in this study too, recreational athletes reported the highest injury and illness severity scores, followed by athletes who competed at something nationally, followed by athletes who competed internationally. And that kind of led me to think about, the differences in the pathways and access to adaptive sport and knowledgeable healthcare providers, like differences between the US and Europe, and how we don't currently have anything that gives us this information in the US. Like we don't have a registry that's collecting this, prevalence when incidence data in the US. So I don't know if anybody has any sort of like any thoughts on, differences in the pathways in the US and people's access to healthcare, or any clinical experience you might have for either monitoring and managing or prevention of injury and illness. Doesn't have to be, this is clinical application. Doesn't need to be anything like step-based. I'm curious, just kind of looking at the registry study here, when it says that recreational athletes had the highest injury and illness severity scores, so on the scale of 0 to 100, and like internationally, so the most elite athletes, right? Their severity, so like how the illness or injury affected their, quality of life or performance, like that's the lowest. And my sort of assumption there would be that's because in that order, nationally competitive and then internationally competitive athletes have access probably to more healthcare providers to give them either more guidance or give them, more options to help keep something from becoming more severe, right? Does that make sense? Kind of following me there? Like, I think that's why, and I think that's why the grassroots, like people getting involved in adaptive sports and grassroots is really, really important. Um, whether you're doing like a basic shoulder strength injury prevention program that you came up with that is more life and sport applicable than stomps, uh, or if you're going in and getting baselines, yeah, and using a modified like SCAT6 for concussion, and then making sure that athletes, even at a recreational level, know when and who they can contact when they get an injury. I'm curious that if this similar study were to be done in the US, and then we were to look at people's actual actual accessibility of a healthcare provider, or looking at something automated, like if they had access to a resource or something that was either they could go to the resource themselves, like a web page that they knew about, or have something automated get sent to them, especially if they were like a more rural athlete, what that would look like as far as prevention, looking at prevalence, or looking at time lost. Just some thoughts, just some thoughts I was thinking. Oh, nice. Yeah, Cody asked about, so I work with a nonprofit called The Bridge locally, that helps connect people with existing adaptive sports organizations in the area, or helps get things started for people if we do anything for injury prevention training. We don't, I wouldn't say it's necessarily injury prevention training, but for some things like like we do a 10K hand cycle for during our marathon weekend. We have a structured training program for athletes who want to participate in the 10K. So it looks at like load management and like properly preparing people to participate in a 10K versus going out and just training on their own. And that plan is ran by an athletic trainer and a PT. Other than like other injury prevention things, I don't think so. We offer, one thing I try to do is get athletes who participate in sports doing our like adaptive CrossFit and functional fitness, just as a way to get some either cross training or some strength training in there. And then usually the coaches who go, or like if I'm there, we'll see how we can either adapt or scale the workout based on like their sports specific needs. So if something has a bunch of overhead pressing in one day, obviously a wheelchair athlete doesn't need to do a bunch of heavy overhead pressing. We would like adjust that as far as like injury prevention and try to do, more pulling versus pushing, if they've needed, but nothing super injury prevention. We do for the Cincinnati Dragons wheelchair basketball, we do like strength and conditioning in the summertime. That looks at some load management and helping get people strong and different power components and stuff like that, but haven't actually measured any if it's if it's been useful at all.
Kind of going back to your question from before, I'm from North Dakota, and so we're pretty rural out here. Don't have a whole lot of opportunities for adaptive sports. I live in one of the bigger cities, so we have like some adaptive sports programs, but it's pretty basic. It's like a couple things are offered per year.
Mm.
So I think for like rural areas like us, an online tool would be helpful just for even like what type of provider should I reach out to so that like patients have access to something that they can, or athletes have access to something that they can figure out like, okay, is this something I should see a PT for, or are there just a few exercises that I can do on my own, something like that? I mean, I feel like it would be really beneficial just for
Yeah.
more accessibility for sure.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I think that was like that's a strength of something like this and like implementing something like this. Most definitely. Okay, and then sort of like my last thing is I was talking about how we don't have any information out there or published about injury prevalence or injury prevention in adaptive sports in the US, but there's a study going on. Not that I'm trying to like bias, but this is some information on it. So it's called the Para Athlete Research for Wellness, Injury Prevention, and Sports Medicine Excellence, or Para-WISE. There's a group from the University of Alabama, University of Cincinnati, and Spalding Rehab up in Boston. And right now, they are just having a registry. So that's injured and uninjured adaptive athletes are able to participate in this registry. This study is only for, it's a 3-month commitment that has weekly surveys with self-reporting like training. So exposure, like how, how often people are training during the week. And then it has a few different surveys that look at quality of life, injury and illness metrics. So there's just our registry that'll hopefully give us some good information, because right now all that's out there in the US is what we have for our elite Paralympic athletes. But we are really hoping that we can get more information for our more recreational athletes as far as prevalence and incidence. So that's sort of the first part of the Pairwise. And then there's a Pairwise Wellness that's just a pilot and feasibility study right now. It's looking at a 5-week comprehensive health and wellness program for para athletes. So there's a once a week weekly meeting with online sessions. So again, anybody from anywhere can participate in this. That's an adaptive athlete. And the weekly sessions look at addressing exercise, nutrition, and mindfulness. And the focus of it is to improve mental health, nutrition, physical activity, and then overall health for adaptive athletes. So I'll share this through the Sigmore, but we're recruiting for both of these right now. So if you want to learn more, there's the QR code that'll take you to a website that talks a little bit more about the registry and the wellness program. And then I also put the RedCamp link, which is on the survey, or which is on the webpage as well. If you have someone you want to recommend, or if you think you might know someone who might be interested in participating in that link for the RedCap, will ask questions about inclusion and exclusion criteria. But it is a pretty inclusive study. There's not a lot of exclusion criteria really at all. So if you know someone or you want to spread the word, we're getting close to the enrollment goal, but definitely still accepting people. Does anybody have any like final closing thoughts? Sweet. Well, great. Thanks everybody for joining us on a Wednesday night. I appreciate it. If you have any questions or anything, don't hesitate to reach out. Like I said, this is being recorded, so we'll get it uploaded to the Academy Learning Center. And if you would like to become more involved in the SIG, I know some people have given me some emails, but don't feel free to shoot me an email and I'll make sure that we have you added to our SIG email list, which I try not to bug people too much. But other than that, thank you guys so much and have an awesome night.